the night the poor girl stepped into the Vampire King's mansion. Her life split into a before and an after, though she did not yet understand it. Her name was Elara, a quiet, gentle young woman who had spent her life surviving rather than living, caring for her sick mother in a cramped rented room on the edge of the city, working long hours as a cleaner and enduring whispers, insults, and cruelty from people who saw her poverty as a weakness. That evening she had come to the mansion only because desperation had pushed her there, an unpaid debt, a landlord's threat, and a mother whose fever refused to break. The mansion itself was a place most humans avoided, a towering structure of black stone and silver-lit windows perched above the city like a watchful shadow, known to belong to the vampire king Lord Kelthorn, a ruler feared across realms for his power, his cold justice, and his centuries-old reign. Elara's hands trembled as she entered, clutching a simple cloth bag with cleaning supplies, her eyes lowered in respect and fear, as servants guided her through endless halls of marble and moonlight. Everything about the place spoke of wealth and immortality: high ceilings painted with constellations, floors polished so smooth they reflected her worn shoes, walls lined with ancient tapestries depicting battles between vampires and forgotten enemies. She felt small and visible, like she always had, until she was instructed to clean the West Gallery, a rarely opened wing of the mansion reserved for the king alone. As Elara worked silently, dusting frames and wiping stone ledges, her gaze caught on something that made her heart stop. At the center of the gallery hung a large portrait illuminated softly by enchanted candles, and the woman painted there had the same gentle eyes, the same familiar curve of the lips, the same faint scar near the brow that Elara had kissed 1,000 times as a child. It was her mother. Younger, healthier, dressed in elegant dark silk, but unmistakably her mother. Elara froze, her breath trapped in her chest, the cloth slipping from her fingers as 1,000 questions crashed into her mind. Why was her mother's face here, in the mansion of the Vampire King? How could a poor herbal healer from the slums belong to a place like this? Before she could gather her thoughts, the air shifted, growing colder and heavier, and she sensed a presence behind her. When she turned, she found herself face to face with Lord Kelthorn himself, tall and imposing, his black cloak edged with silver, his pale features sharp and unreadable, crimson eyes glowing faintly like embers beneath ice. Servants bowed and fled, leaving the two of them alone in the vast gallery, silence pressing down like a weight. Elara should have bowed, should have apologized, should have looked away, but the shock and pain in her chest gave her courage she did not know she possessed. Her voice shook, but it did not break as she spoke the words that would change everything. "My lord, why is my mother's photo in your mansion?" For a heartbeat, the Vampire King did not move. Then something unbelievable happened. His breath caught, a sharp, almost human sound, and the controlled mask he wore cracked just enough for raw emotion to seep through. The candles flickered wildly, shadows leaping across the walls as if the mansion itself reacted to his turmoil. Kelthorn stared at the portrait, then at Elara, his gaze lingering on her face as though seeing echoes of someone he had lost. Slowly, deliberately, he approached the painting, lifting a gloved hand but stopping just short of touching it. "This woman," he said at last, his voice low and strained, "was the only human I ever loved." Elara's knees nearly gave way. The words felt unreal, impossible, and yet they explained everything: the sorrow in the king's eyes, the loneliness that filled the mansion despite its grandeur. Kelthorn turned to her fully now, studying her features with painful intensity, and Elara realized he was seeing the resemblance too. He asked her questions, careful and precise: her mother's name, her illness, her lost memories, the strange moon-shaped locket her mother always wore but could never explain. With each answer, the king's expression darkened, grief and guilt warring beneath his composed exterior. He confessed that centuries ago, her mother had vanished from his life without explanation, that he had searched for her across kingdoms and realms until hope itself had withered, and that the Vampire Council had insisted she had betrayed him, that loving a human made him weak. Elara listened, tears streaming silently down her face, realizing her mother's past had been stolen, not forgotten, and that the life of struggle she had lived was built on a buried injustice. As the truth settled between them, a distant echo of wings and a sudden chill warned Kelthorne that their conversation had not gone unnoticed. Dark forces within his own court were stirring, threatened by the return of a truth they believed erased. Stepping forward, the Vampire King did something no one in the mansion had ever seen. He lowered himself slightly, not in submission, but in solemn respect, and spoke words that bound their fates together. "If you are her daughter," he said, "then you are under my protection now. And I swear on my crown and my blood, whoever took her memories and condemned you both to suffering will answer for it." The gallery seemed to breathe again as Elara realized that in asking one simple question, she had awakened a love, a war, and a destiny far greater than her fear, and this was only the beginning of the story. By the time dawn's pale light crept through the high-stained windows of the mansion, Elara felt as though she had lived an entire lifetime since asking that one question, and yet the truth was only beginning to unfold. Lord Kelthorne did not send her away as she feared. Instead, he ordered servants to prepare a warm chamber near the inner gardens, a place usually reserved for honored guests, not poor human girls from the slums. Elara noticed the way the servants stared at her with confusion and quiet judgment, some with pity, others with thinly veiled resentment, but none dared question the king's command. Once alone, Kelthorne explained what little he could without exposing her to immediate danger, his voice calm but heavy, like stone worn smooth by centuries of regret. He told her her mother's name had once been spoken with reverence in his court, that she was known for her kindness, her healing knowledge, and her refusal to fear monsters when others trembled, and that their bond had been a secret the Vampire Council despised. Elara listened, torn between anger and awe, struggling to reconcile the gentle woman who had sung her to sleep with the idea of her mother standing beside a vampire king. When Elara spoke of her mother's illness and lost memories, Kelthorne's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists as if holding back something violent and ancient, and he admitted what he had long suspected but never dared prove. Someone had erased her mother's past to protect the throne. The Vampire Council, guardians of tradition and power, believed a human queen would weaken their rule, and when persuasion failed, they chose cruelty instead. Elara's heart burned with quiet fury, not at the king, but at the injustice that had shaped her entire life without her consent. As the day progressed, Kelthorne summoned his most trusted healer, an ancient vampire woman with silver hair and eyes like polished glass, to examine Elara and confirm her lineage through blood resonance, a sacred ritual rarely used. Elara was terrified, but she stood firm, remembering her mother's lessons about courage, and when the ritual confirmed the truth, the room fell silent with shock. She was not only the daughter of a human healer, but the child of a woman once chosen to stand beside a king. That knowledge spread quickly through whispered corridors, and with it came danger. Members of the council convened in secret, their anger sharp and immediate, seeing Elara not as a person but as a threat, a living reminder of a past they had tried to bury. Elara sensed the shift in the mansion's atmosphere that night, the way shadows lingered too long and servants avoided her gaze, and when she overheard two guards mocking her poverty and calling her a mistake, she felt the familiar sting of humiliation return. Yet this time, something was different. Instead of shrinking away, she lifted her head and walked past them with quiet dignity, unaware that Kelthorne watched from a distant balcony, noting the strength in her posture and the restraint in her eyes. That small moment impressed him more than any display of bravery could have, and it stirred something protective deep within his immortal heart. Later that evening, Kelthorne visited Elara's chamber personally, bringing food and a sealed vial of rare moonblood medicine, powerful enough to stabilize her mother's condition if used correctly. He warned her softly that the council would not remain idle, that some would attempt to scare her into leaving while others might try far worse, and he gave her a choice he had never offered another human. She could leave the mansion with protection and resources, or she could stay and face the truth alongside him. Elara did not answer immediately. She thought of her mother's tired smile, of years spent being invisible, of a truth that had been stolen from them both, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady. She chose to stay. That decision sealed her fate. The following day the council summoned. Kelthorne to an emergency assembly accusing him of endangering vampire law and tradition by harboring a human tied to royal secrets, and when Alara was brought before them, she felt their collective hostility like a physical force. They questioned her origins, her intentions, even her worth. Their words sharp and dismissive, but Alara answered honestly, without arrogance or fear, speaking only of her desire to heal her mother and understand the truth. Her humility unsettled them more than defiance ever could. When one elder cruelly suggested that humans existed only to serve or be forgotten, Kelthorne finally intervened, his voice echoing through the chamber with controlled fury as he reminded them that their power meant nothing without justice. The confrontation ended without resolution, but lines were drawn, and Alara understood that the mansion, once a symbol of fear, had become a battlefield she had never asked to enter. That night, as she stood in the garden beneath a silver moon, Kelthorne joined her in silence, neither speaking of love nor destiny. Yet the unspoken bond between them grew stronger, forged not by romance but by shared pain and mutual respect, and Alara realized that kindness, even in the darkest place, could be a quiet form of rebellion. As the days passed inside the Vampire King's mansion, Alara began to understand that danger did not always announce itself with claws or fangs, but often arrived disguised as silence, whispers, and false courtesy. And this realization hardened her resolve even as fear tried to take root in her heart. The council's judgment had not removed her from the castle, but it had changed the way everyone looked at her. Servants became distant guards, watched her too closely, and strangers she did not recognize lingered in corridors where they did not belong, their eyes cold and measuring. Kelthorne increased security around her without explanation, assigning a shadow guard to follow at a distance, though he himself treated Alara with calm respect rather than control, never ordering her, never raising his voice, as if determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. One afternoon, while exploring the West Wing library under supervision, Alara discovered an ancient tome hidden behind a false shelf, its leather cover marked with the same crescent moon symbol found on her mother's locket, and when she touched it, a strange warmth pulsed through her fingers as though the book recognized her. The librarian froze in alarm and rushed to inform Kelthorne, who arrived moments later, his expression tightening as he saw what Alara held. He admitted that the book contained forbidden knowledge, written in an ancient tongue older than the vampire realm itself, a language once spoken by healers who could mend not just bodies, but memories. To everyone's shock, Alara began reading the symbols aloud without effort, her voice steady and clear, even though she had never been taught the language, and the words flowed from her as naturally as breath. The room fell into stunned silence as Kelthorne realized the truth of what the council had feared all along. Alara was not merely the daughter of a human woman, but the last living link to a lost lineage of healers whose power threatened the council's control. News of the incident spread quickly, and by nightfall, the council declared Alara a liability, claiming her presence endangered vampire secrecy and stability, and whispers of punishment began to circulate. When Alara overheard fragments of these conversations, fear finally overwhelmed her, and she questioned whether staying had been a mistake, whether her existence only brought suffering to those she loved. Kelthorne found her that evening in the moon garden, trembling but unbroken, and for the first time, he spoke not as a king, but as a man burdened by centuries of regret. He confessed that loving her mother had taught him humility, that losing her had taught him cruelty, and that seeing Alara stand firm in the face of injustice reminded him of everything he had once believed in. Instead of promising safety through power, he promised honesty, telling her that danger would come, but she would never face it alone. Their bond deepened quietly in that moment, not through romance, but through shared understanding and mutual respect, a slow-burning connection built on trust rather than desire. That same night, the council made their move. Assassins loyal to the elders breached the inner corridors, cloaked in shadow magic meant to bypass royal wards, and Alara was awakened by the sound of shattering glass and raised voices. Her shadow guard was struck down protecting her door, and panic surged through her veins, but instinct guided her as she fled through hidden passageways her mother had once memorized long ago. Cornered in an abandoned hall, Alara refused to scream or beg, remembering her mother's lessons about bravery. And when one assassin lunged, she spoke a single word in the ancient language without knowing what it meant. Light burst from her chest like dawn breaking through darkness, knocking the attackers back and sealing the hall in radiant energy. Kelthorn arrived moments later, fury unlike anything Alara had ever seen radiating from him, his power shaking the walls as he dispatched the remaining attackers with terrifying precision. Yet when he turned to Alara, his voice softened instantly, concern overtaking rage, and he knelt before her to ensure she was unharmed, an act that stunned the watching guards. The failed assassination could no longer be hidden, and by morning, the council stood exposed as traitors to their own laws. Alara, shaken but alive, realized that her existence had crossed a point of no return, and that running would not save anyone. Instead of retreating into fear, she made a choice that surprised even Kelthorn. She demanded the right to heal her mother using the ancient knowledge awakening within her and to confront the council, not as a victim, but as a witness to their crimes. As Kelthorn looked at her pride and protectiveness mixing in his eyes, he understood that the poor invisible girl who had entered his mansion days ago was gone, replaced by a woman discovering her strength, and the balance of power in the vampire realm had begun to shift. By the time Alara insisted on bringing her mother into the Vampire King's mansion, the air around the court was already thick with tension, as if the castle itself sensed that the truth it had buried for years was clawing its way back to the surface. Kelthorn tried to reason with her at first, warning that moving her mother into the heart of vampire politics could expose her to danger far worse than illness, but Alara's resolve did not waver, because she understood something he did not fully grasp yet. Hiding had never saved her mother before. With guarded escorts and wards layered thick as stone, her mother, Lyria, was brought into the mansion. Frail and pale, her eyes distant yet calm, unaware of the storm her presence would unleash. As soon as she crossed the threshold, something ancient stirred within the walls, a low vibration that traveled through marble and blood alike, and Lyria paused, pressing a trembling hand to her chest as if hearing a voice only she could sense. Servants whispered, guards tightened their grips on weapons, and members of the council watched from balconies and corridors, their expressions ranging from fear to barely concealed hatred. Alara stayed close to her mother's side, offering quiet reassurances, while Kelthorn observed with a mixture of hope and dread, knowing that if Lyria's memories returned, they would expose crimes that could tear the vampire realm apart. That night, Lyria was settled into a sunlit chamber overlooking the inner gardens, and as Alara prepared a healing ritual guided by the ancient knowledge awakening within her, the crescent moon locket around her mother's neck began to glow faintly, responding to Alara's presence. When Alara spoke the ancient words, the air shimmered and Lyria gasped, clutching her head as fragments of memory surged forward. Moonlit forests, whispered laughter, a man with sorrowful red eyes, and a promise spoken beneath the stars. She cried out, not in pain, but in recognition. And when her gaze finally focused on Kelthorn standing silently at the edge of the room, her breath caught. She did not know his name, but her heart remembered him. The moment shattered what remained of the council's patience. Before dawn, they struck again, this time openly, storming the healing chamber under the pretense of enforcing ancient law, accusing Lyria of witchcraft and Alara of treason. In the chaos, one elder revealed himself as the architect of Lyria's stolen memories, boasting that erasing a human's past had been a small price to preserve vampire dominance. The confession froze the room, and Alara felt something inside her shift, not into rage, but into clarity. She stepped forward, shielding her mother with her body, and spoke not as a frightened girl, but as a healer and a witness, recounting years of poverty, suffering, and humiliation that had grown from the council's cruelty. Her words cut deeper than any blade because they were calm, honest, and impossible to dismiss. Kelthorn finally unleashed his authority, his voice echoing through the chamber as he declared the elder under arrest for crimes against both human and vampire law. But the damage was done, the council was fractured, and loyalty could no longer be assumed. In the aftermath, Lyria collapsed from exhaustion, her memories only partially restored, and Alara stayed by her side through the night, whispering comfort while Kelthorn stood guard, refusing to leave. In those quiet hours, something unspoken grew between Alara and the king, not romance, but a deep mutual understanding forged through shared responsibility and sacrifice. By morning, word of the council's betrayal spread beyond the castle, stirring unrest among vampire clans who had long trusted their leaders, and Ilara realized that her fight was no longer just personal, it had become a challenge to an unjust system. When Kelthorn asked her if she regretted bringing her mother into danger, Ilara met his gaze steadily and answered that truth was never safe, but it was always necessary, and for the first time in centuries. The vampire king smiled without sadness, seeing not a fragile human to protect, but an equal standing beside him as the realm's future hung in the balance. The council's response to the shattered secrecy was swift and merciless, and within a single day a formal decree echoed through the vampire king's mansion declaring that Ilara's existence posed an unacceptable risk to the throne, framing her not as a victim of injustice, but as a dangerous anomaly that threatened centuries of carefully controlled power. The elders gathered in the grand tribunal hall, their voices cold and authoritative, and summoned Kelthorn to answer for what they called betrayal of vampire law, accusing him of placing in motion above order and allowing a human girl to disrupt the balance of their world. Ilara stood beside her recovering mother as guards escorted them into the hall, feeling the familiar sting of being judged for her poverty, her humanity, and her refusal to stay silent, yet she kept her head high, drawing strength from everything she had endured. One elder, his voice dripping with disdain, pronounced the council's verdict with chilling calm. Ilara was to be removed permanently, quietly, before her presence inspired rebellion or exposed further truths, and if Kelthorn resisted, the council would invoke ancient law to strip him of his crown. The hall fell into tense silence, broken only by the soft sound of Ilara's mother breathing beside her, fragile but alive. For a moment it seemed as though history would repeat itself, that power would crush the innocent once again. But Kelthorn surprised them all by stepping forward and doing something no vampire king had done in recorded history. He lowered himself before the council, not in submission, but in deliberate defiance of their cruelty, making it clear that he would rather lose his throne than sacrifice another innocent life for their comfort. The act sent shockwaves through the room, murmurs rippling among guards and nobles alike, because the king they feared had chosen conscience over dominance. Ilara felt tears burn her eyes, not from weakness, but from the weight of being protected by someone who finally understood the cost of silence. Regaining his feet, Kelthorn demanded justice, not mercy, and called forth the evidence Ilara had risked everything to uncover. Using the ancient language that now came naturally to her, Ilara activated the crescent locket, and the hidden sigils etched into the chamber's stone, revealing memory fragments stolen from her mother years ago, memories the council had sworn never existed. The air filled with shimmering visions of the past. Lyria, being confronted by elders, offered safety if she abandoned Kelthorn, then bound by magic when she refused, her memories torn away piece by piece until she collapsed helpless and alone. The visions ended with her being cast into the human world, stripped of protection and history, condemned to poverty and suffering without understanding why. Gasps echoed through the hall as even loyal council members recoiled at the truth, unable to deny what their own eyes witnessed. Lyria, overwhelmed by the restored memories, whispered Kelthorn's name at last, her voice weak but certain, and the sound of it broke something deep inside him that centuries of restraint had kept locked away. He reached for her hand, not as a king claiming a lost love, but as a man acknowledging a wrong he had failed to prevent. The elder responsible tried to dismiss the visions as illusion, but his lies fell flat against the undeniable power of truth, and the guards hesitated, torn between duty and conscience. Ilara spoke again, quietly but firmly, explaining that her mother's suffering was not an isolated act, that many humans had been erased, silenced, or used in the name of vampire superiority, and that allowing such injustice to continue would poison the realm far more than any human ever could. Her words carried weight not because of magic, but because they were rooted in lived pain and unwavering honesty. The tribunal dissolved into chaos as factions formed, some elders demanding punishment, others calling for reform, and for the first time, the council's authority visibly cracked. Kelthorn seized that moment, declaring that any law requiring the death of an innocent was no law worth preserving, and he placed Ilara and her mother under royal protection that no council vote could overturn without open rebellion. As the hall slowly emptied, the threat had not vanished, but it had changed shape. The enemy was no longer hidden, and justice, though delayed, was finally within reach. Ilara realized then that she was no longer just fighting for her family, but for every voiceless human crushed beneath immortal pride, and though fear still lingered, it no longer controlled her. The final reckoning came not with screams or bloodshed, but with a quiet shift that echoed louder than any war, as the vampire realm awakened to a truth it could no longer deny. In the days following the fractured tribunal, word spread beyond the mansion walls, carried by messengers, whispers, and shared memories, reaching clans who had long believed the council spoke with unquestionable authority. Ilara remained by her mother's side as Lyria slowly regained strength, fragments of her past settling into place not as pain but as clarity, and with each recovered memory, the injustice done to her became impossible to ignore. Kelthorn moved carefully but decisively, summoning clan leaders and elders not to threaten them with power but to present the truth Ilara had revealed, allowing them to witness the stolen memories and judge for themselves whether such cruelty deserved loyalty. Many arrived expecting a display of dominance from their king and instead found a ruler, willing to expose his own failures, admitting that his silence had enabled suffering and that immortality meant nothing if built on fear and erased lives. Ilara stood beside him during these gatherings, not as a queen or symbol, but as herself, a human woman who had endured humiliation, loss, and danger without surrendering her compassion, and it was her presence that shifted hearts more than any royal decree. When one clan leader publicly denounced the council's actions as dishonorable, others followed, and the remaining elders who clung to the old ways found themselves isolated, their power eroded not by rebellion but by collective refusal to obey injustice. The architect of Lyria's memory erasure was formally stripped of rank and imprisoned under ancient law, his fate sealed not by vengeance, but by accountability, and for the first time in generations, the council's authority bent toward reform. As the realm stabilized, Kelthorn made a decision that surprised both vampires and humans alike, declaring protections for human healers, workers, and servants, ensuring they could no longer be silenced or discarded without consequence. And while some resisted, most recognized that a kingdom strengthened by justice endured longer than one ruled by fear. Through it all, the bond between Ilara and Kelthorn continued to grow quietly, without grand confessions or dramatic gestures built. Instead, on shared responsibility, respect, and countless small moments of understanding, like late-night conversations in the garden or silent companionship beside Lyria's bed as she slept peacefully for the first time in years. When Lyria finally looked at Kelthorn with full recognition, her memories restored, there was no rush to reclaim what had been lost, only a calm acceptance of what remained, as she thanked him not for power or promises, but for choosing to protect their daughter when it mattered most. Ilara, once invisible and overlooked, now found herself seen not for destiny or magic, but for the courage she had always carried quietly within her. And when Kelthorn offered her a place beside him in shaping the future of the realm, he did so without command or expectation, leaving the choice entirely hers. Ilara took time before answering, reflecting on her past, her mother's suffering, and the countless people like them who had been dismissed as insignificant, and when she finally spoke, she made it clear that she would stand with him only if the kingdom remained committed to dignity, humility, and accountability. Kelthorn accepted without hesitation, not as a king claiming a queen, but as a ruler acknowledging an equal, and in that moment, the vampire realm changed in a way no prophecy had predicted. The story of the poor girl who asked one forbidden question spread across realms, becoming a quiet legend not of romance alone but of justice earned through compassion, reminding both immortal and mortal alike that true power is measured not by fear inspired, but by lives uplifted.